I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you updates and news from across Ukraine as Zelensky again changes his top team. We analyse a deadly fire at a Russian research institute and discuss the impact that trade from China is having on the Russian war effort.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
If we give President Zelensky the tools, the Ukrainians will finish the job. Slava Ukraini!
Nobody's gonna break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 25th of June, 2 years and 127 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Brussels Correspondent Joe Barnes, and our guest is Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, Joe Webster. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi David, and hello wherever you are. So breaking in the last hour that I've seen reported on the Kyiv Independent, the International Criminal Court, the ICC, has said today that it's issued an arrest warrant for General Gerasimov, Russia's Chief of General Staff, and also Sergei Shoigu, who's now Secretary of the Security Council, former Defense Minister. The charges relate to Russian strikes on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, the ICC has said, covering the period when Shoigu was Defence Minister. That's why he's on the ticket for this particular issue. The court found that, quote, there are reasonable grounds to believe that the alleged strikes were directed against civilian objects. It sounds a bit clunky and a bit straightforward and obvious, but when it comes to international law, you've got to go through the motions. So, yes, that is fairly straightforward. I think it is pretty obvious they were against civilian objects, but you've got to start somewhere. So, yeah, that story is breaking. We'll keep our eye on that. Now, elsewhere, onto the ground, if you like, inside Russia, and Ukraine has claimed this morning that it hit an ammunition depot in the Voronezh region of Russia. Ukraine's defense ministry said a field ammunition depot of the Russian aggressor army was hit in the Olkhovatsky district of Russia's Voronezh region. So this is about 150 k's due east of Kharkiv, the city, over the border, about 20 k's inside Russia. Corroborating those claims, Alexander Gusev, who's the governor of Voronezh, Russian man, said that 2 of his districts had been attacked by Ukraine overnight. He said no civilians had been injured. Local state media footage showed fire raging and there were several loud explosions ringing out from a site that there was a sort of imageries of fields and trees. Unusually, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the HUR, has claimed responsibility for the strike. They're often a bit coy about it if they say anything at all, and only then it's often days later. But they've come out this morning and said that they claimed responsibility for that strike. Now, staying inside Russia, let's move about 200 kilometers west to Belgorod Oblast. That's the oblast inside Russia. It borders Kharkiv Oblast, and the area we're talking about is about 50 k's due north of Kharkiv city. And Russia says that what they call a major Ukrainian drone attack on the city of Belgorod has killed an elderly woman, injured 4 others. This comes from Vyacheslav Gladkov, the governor of the region. Speaking last night, he said the city of Belgorod and the Belgorod district were subjected to a massive attack by UAVs. Russia's MOD said that its air defense had destroyed 29 Ukrainian drones fired towards Belgorod. Staying inside Russia and go to the capital, and there was a big fire yesterday at the Research and Scientific Center in Moscow. People were seen, or 2 people at least seen, jumping to their deaths from the top floors of a burning building linked to the production of Russian weaponry. At least 6 others were reported to have died in the fire. This comes from state-owned TASS news agency. The fire broke out yesterday at the 9-story Platan Research Institute building in the town of Ferizino. That's a scientific hub in the Moscow suburbs. It has been sanctioned by the US for producing parts for fighter jets and nuclear launchers. Footage showed a high-rise block ravaged with flames, smoke billowing out, and close-up images showed a number of workers who appeared to be trapped inside the building. Andrei Vorobyov, who's Moscow's regional governor, said 1 person had been rescued, but later added, it's known for sure that while trying to escape, 2 men jumped out of the window. Unfortunately, they died. Footage showed people smashing windows to try and escape the flames, which seems to have started from the first floor. The Caution News Telegram channel published footage of a man waving from the building. And Mr. Vorobyev said one of the victims, a 34-year-old man, is in a serious condition in intensive care. He was connected to a ventilator. 2 firefighters sought medical attention due to combustion poisoning. Now, Platan is said to be a producer of electronic components for Russia's OD, under sanctions since June 22, as I said. An archived version of its website said that it had produced parts for Russian fighter jets, S-400 air defense systems and various other guided munitions. Mr. Vorobyev said the blaze had been triggered by oxygen tanks belonging to one of the 30 companies based in the building. The blaze was the latest in a string of unexplained fires at facilities linked to Russia's armed forces, particularly since the start of the full-scale invasion. You may remember a fire broke out at the Moscow-based Sukhoi Design Bureau that's responsible for the production of many of the country's advanced fighter jets. And then in April, a blaze was reported at the Avant-Garde military plant, the only known producer of S-300 surface-to-air missiles. Ukraine has never claimed credit for these incidents, although the head of the military intelligence, Major General Bodanov, Kyrylo Bodanov, he did say last year that acts of sabotage were, quote, almost 100% by citizens of the Russian Federation, unquote. Now, when I interviewed him in Kyiv in February, I asked General Bodanov about these types of attacks inside Russia, and he said to me, it's clear that during the war, intelligence is responsible not only for gathering data, but also conducting special operations. Working with big groups of people, you can call them partisans, is just a small part of our activities. We help them, support them, and interact with them. Sometimes we ask them to perform some tasks. End of quote. I thought he was quite open with me about that. Now, whether or not this is supported by Ukraine or self-starters in Russia, we don't know. Probably unlikely to hear, but interesting nonetheless. Russia's thought to be behind various attacks on NATO countries that have supported Ukraine in recent months. Mysterious fires at a warehouse in East London, an IKEA in Lithuania and a shopping centre in Poland have all triggered warnings from Western officials of Russian-backed sabotage. A large fire at an arms factory in Berlin last month was likely caused by Russians trying to disrupt weapon deliveries, intelligence officials have said. Now, speaking of Bodanov, and he has said that Western military assistance is starting to arrive in Ukraine. This is from the US drawdown, the $61 billion. But however, he said it's not likely to arrive at a scale that will significantly impact the frontline situation until at least mid to late July this year. Now, the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, are reporting that Bodanov was sitting down for an interview with the Philadelphia Inquirer, which they think was conducted sometime around June 12th or 13th. It was only published yesterday. And he said that US and European weapons deliveries, including artillery ammunition, are arriving in Ukraine at a faster pace than several months ago. But he did say there's a question of volume. General Bodanov said that, quote, no Armageddon will emerge on the front line. But he did say the frontline situation is going to be difficult for at least another month. He also said that a sufficient quantity of US-provided ATACMS missiles could allow Ukrainian forces to strike the Kerch Bridge. And ISW say the destruction of that bridge would force Russia to rely on the long route along the northern coast of the Sea of Azov. And that would exacerbate vulnerabilities for Ukrainian forces trying to exploit the Russian main, what they call GLOC. That's called ground line of communication. Yeah, road, basically. Road or railway line, but ground line of communication, sea line of communication, air line of communication. But they're talking about the GLOC in this instance, David.
Well, thank you very much for those updates, Dom. Can we go inside Ukraine then? There's quite a few bits of Zelensky's ongoing reshuffle that I think we need to talk about. What have you been looking at in terms of news from within the country?
Sure. Well, firstly, there's not been an awful lot of movement on the ground. Geolocated footage published yesterday showed that Ukrainian forces continue to close down the Vovchansk incursions, or whatever those things are, north of Kharkiv. They are slowly being drawn down. Confirmed footage there that Ukraine is making advances. However, also confirmed footage that elsewhere in the Donbass, Russia's made marginal advances west as well. But very little movement generally. However, you're right, President Zelensky has been reshuffling his people. He's replaced Ukraine's Joint Forces commander after an Azov chief accused the commander of, quote, killing more Ukrainians than any Russian general. Now, speaking in his address last night, President Zelensky gave no reason for the dismissal of Lieutenant General Yuri Sodol from his very senior role, planning major operations at the strategic level. However, Ukrainian media earlier reported that Bogdan Krochevich, who's a senior officer in the Azov National Guard Brigade, had formally filed a request for the investigation of General Sodol. In a post on Telegram, Krochevich wrote, "I called for an investigation into one military general who, in my opinion, caused more Ukrainian casualties than any Russian general. I don't care if they investigate me or put me in jail. It's unacceptable that lower-ranking officers are judged for losing observation posts, but the general is not held accountable for losing entire regions and thousands of soldiers." Now, although Krochevich didn't name the general, Ukrainska Pravda, that's a Ukrainian newspaper, had sources that confirmed that it was General Sodol, and he has been replaced by Brigadier General Andrei Anatov, President Zelensky said last night. Now, elsewhere, President Zelensky has also ordered the new head of Ukraine's security service, the SBU, to clear out those not committed to Ukraine and who, he says, discredit the agency. President Zelensky made the comments whilst introducing Colonel Alexei Morozov, who was named last week as the new head of the SBU. He was being introduced to staff yesterday. The move comes after the SBU said in May that it had caught two of its serving officers cooperating with Russia and plotting the assassination of President Zelensky and other leading officials. So a bit of a mole hunt and a clean out going on there, David.
Absolutely. And Dom, finally, there's been some movement on aid to Ukraine. The Associated Press have got an interesting story. Can you start there?
Yeah, a bit of numbers here. So AP, Associated Press, reporting that the US is expected to announce today that it's sending an additional $150 million worth of critically needed munitions to Ukraine. This comes from two unnamed US officials, AP say. Now, the upcoming shipment is expected to include HIMARS munitions. One of the US officials said they could not verify whether this package included ATACMS, but said the aid did not include cluster munitions. Obviously, there's different types of ATACMS munitions, a single unitary warhead, as in a massive great big bang, and also the other warhead that has cluster munitions. Now, this package also thought to include anti-armour weapons, small arms, grenades, and both 155 and 105 mil artillery rounds, and a few other bits and pieces. Speaking of artillery, the first batch of shells from the Czech-led drive to buy ammunition for Ukraine has arrived in country, Prague said this morning. Petr Fiala, who's Czech Prime Minister, put a thing out on X today saying the first shipment of ammunition from our initiative arrived in Ukraine some time ago. We are doing what it takes. Czech government officials said last month that Ukraine would receive up to 100,000 155mm shells in June alone via the initiative. And this project sees the Czech Republic, or Czechia, leading the fundraising drive outside of the EU. You'll remember the EU, and Joe Barnes has reported extensively on this, the EU fell well short of meeting its target of providing 1 million shells over the 12 months to March. So that possibly one of the reasons, we don't know the exact reason, but possibly one of the reasons why this Czech-led initiative, one of the 8 capability coalitions of air and artillery and so on and so forth that we've covered before, was set up. 18 countries are said to have signed up to this particular strand, Prague says. Now, separately, a couple more, what's kind of diplomatic, if I may, just dip in here. Ukraine recorded 715 cases of Russian chemical weapons use on the battlefield in May. That's nearly 300 more than the previous month. This is reporting by the Kyiv Independent. In a post on Facebook, the Ukrainian military support forces said most cases of this chemical weapons use were of CS gas, sometimes referred to as tear gas, typically used as a crowd control agent by law enforcement agencies around the world. Although it's less lethal than other chemical weapons, and it was used extensively in the First World War, before the 1925 Geneva Protocol prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in war, it is still very potent, particularly in trenches. It's heavier than air, so it sinks into a trench, into a thing dug underground. So if that's where you are sheltering, because it comes at the same time as an artillery strike, that's where all this stuff is going to sit, and it can cause extreme difficulty, and it can cause death if it's a very high concentration. Now, Ukraine support forces said that from February the 15th, 23 to May 24th this year, a total of nearly 2,700 cases had been recorded, which had led to 1,385 incidents of Ukrainian soldiers needing medical attention. Ukrainian military officials have previously accused Russia of using chlorpyrifos and other chemical weapons. Hamish DBG has spoken. He talked to us about chlorpyrifos. It's often used as a herbicide, and according to the US Centers for Disease Control, exposure to it can cause severe irritation to the skin, eyes, and if inhaled, internal organs. The OPCW, that's the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, said on May the 7th that accusations from both Ukraine and Russia that the other had used chemical weapons since the full-scale invasion remain insufficiently substantiated. The OPCW said in a statement, both the Russian Federation and Ukraine have accused one another and reported allegations of use of chemical weapons to the organisation. The information provided to the organisation so far by both sides, together with the information available to the Secretariat, is insufficiently substantiated. They said the situation, quote, remains volatile and extremely concerning, unquote, and they reiterated that it was against international law to use riot control agents on the battlefield. Now, OPCW also noted it had not received official requests to investigate the use of chemical weapons use from either Ukraine or Russia, and it would be blooming difficult to do so anyway. And just one final one for me, David. On the diplomatic front, Moscow has said that Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, is going to be visiting Russia soon. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign affairs aide, said that Mr. Modi's visit is being prepared and that a date would be jointly announced in the future. Under Mr. Modi's leadership, you'll remember, India they've danced a fine line, avoided condemning Russia directly, but urged for a peaceful settlement in Ukraine, whilst also, we think, enjoying a lot of cheap oil and gas, oil in particular. And separately, Russia's Deputy Foreign Minister, Andrei Rudenko, said Moscow expects shortly to sign a new cooperation pact with Iran. In a statement, he said, we expect that this agreement will be signed in the very near future, since work on the text is already close to completion. All the necessary wording has been found. Now, no details have emerged on what that agreement's going to include, but it's likely to be a whole load of drones. And as I said last week, that need not be on the diplomatic front. That will undermine Putin's complaints about international support for Ukraine, because Putin can't openly and brazenly be accepting aid from Iran, North Korea, signing all these defence pacts and what have you, and then complain that the international community elsewhere want to provide military assistance and cash for Ukraine. So I haven't seen a comment yet about any new aid for Ukraine, but it's just further weakened by these kind of agreements that Russia's making with Iran, North Korea and others. And I'll take a pause there, David.
Thank you so much, Dom. Now let's go to our Brussels correspondent, Joe Barnes, who's got updates from a big week in European politics for Ukraine.
Hi folks, it's a big week for Ukraine in European Union politics. I'll start with a story that European Union foreign ministers were able to unlock what they described as a 1.4 billion euro war chest for Ukraine to buy weapons using the profits or the proceeds from frozen Russian assets inside the European Union. The actual dispersal of the money was being vetoed by Hungary. I don't have to go into many reasons why Hungary was doing that, but you know for various reasons that Hungary is against the delivery, the donation of weapons to Ukraine. So the EU, after seeking legal advice from the European Council's legal service, said it had a legal procedure to get around any Hungarian veto. So announcing this before foreign ministers in Luxembourg had actually agreed to this on Monday, Joseph Borrell said, we have revenues coming from the frozen assets and we have to look for a way in order to use them, avoiding any kind of blockage. This money cannot get stuck. It has to be used and we have a legal procedure to avoid any kind of blockage. What is that legal procedure? Basically, the European Council's legal service, it's like legal Eagles, to be precise, has advised national capitals that any Hungarian veto is invalid because Hungary abstained from an earlier vote on the creation of what has become known as the EU's Ukraine Assistance Fund. This is the cash pot of EU funds used to buy weapons for Kyiv. So when this vote was going through a while back, Hungary agreed to let it go through with a constructive abstention. And then essentially the EU's lawyers have said that Hungary now has no right to block this going forward because it didn't participate in the original vote. This is how Joseph Borrell, who's the EU's top foreign diplomat, described it. He said, "We consider that since Hungary did not participate in the decision, it is not necessary they could participate in the implementation. The decision is clear. The revenues coming from the Russian frozen assets will be used to increase our military support to Ukraine. We need to use the money, and we have a legal procedure in order to advance any blockage from member states that were not part of the decision." So what's interesting about this is actually now, and I've been speaking to diplomats about this, given hope that the EU will be able to back a G7 loan using the proceeds of frozen Russian assets. So the loan is for around $50 billion, about £42 billion. And the G7 leaders, when they were in Italy the other week, said that they would hope to get this money organised and arranged by December, they said, but the end of the year is what I've done. So they basically believe that the EU now, because Hungary has agreed to step aside, will be able to use the same legal justification. It's not done yet, but it's possible. And I like this. This is a small detail I included in my piece. It's online if you want to have a read. That the EU basically agreed to legally exclude Hungary from the process of dispersing funds using the proceeds of frozen Russian assets after they offered Viktor Orban essentially a sort of a peace offering, a peace deal on this. The EU tried to mirror a decision that was made between Orban and Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, which gave Hungary an opt-out from any Ukrainian actions undertaken by NATO in return for not blocking other member states assisting Kyiv. Viktor Orban and his government said no to that to the EU, so the EU just went, well, you know what? Well, we've got our lawyers working on it, we've got this way of getting around, you're not going to stop us. Very interesting stuff. Then another big moment, again in Luxembourg. The EU will today, so it's Tuesday, open official accession talks with Kyiv and also Moldova at the same time. That's a huge step. Look, there's not much to go into it. It's not going to give us a fixed date of when Ukraine can join the EU, when Moldova can join the EU. But what it does is it actually moves them from candidate status to official. We're negotiating how you join the EU. We're working on those reforms that are needed. How do we implement parts of the single market so you can open up for free movement and stuff like that? So lots of details to hammer out, but they're in Luxembourg doing that now. So we should get some sort of negotiating framework agreed soon, which basically charts out a more concrete process on that. And then, thirdly, I'd like to say there's rumours, rather strong rumours now, that President Volodymyr Zelensky will be in Brussels this week for an EU leaders summit on Thursday and Friday, where apparently the European Union is going to offer Kyiv a security assurances package, much like has been agreed by the UK, the US, France, these bilateral agreements that were agreed firstly by G7 countries and then it's been widened. So look, we don't know the contents exactly of what the EU is going to offer, but we can imagine it is putting in writing exactly the same things the likes of the UK, US, France, Italy, so-and-so have agreed to with Kyiv. So it'd be things like we will continue to send money for arms, other security arrangements, as long as this war is going on. When this war comes to an end, what we will do is we will promise that if Russia attacks Ukraine again, we will move to basically restart arms shipments. We will bring back sanctions against Russia and basically act as a long-term support promise for Ukraine, probably over a 10-year period as well. So it's not the cast-iron NATO Article 5 guarantee, which is that the mutual defence clause. So if one member's attacked, other members will come to its aid. It's a bit stop short of that, but it is a promise that we will resume the same level, or at least try to resume the same level of support for Ukraine going forward for the next decade or so.
Thank you so much, Joe. For today's final segment, I spoke to Joe Webster, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. Joe has been looking at the issue of trade between China and Russia, and we spoke about what exactly is crossing borders, how it impacts the Russian war effort in Ukraine, and what the West may be able to do about it. Here's our conversation. Can we start with quite a broad question then? What's the current state of trade between China and Russia, and how has that changed over the past 2 years?
Yeah, so thanks for having me back on, David. Great to be back here. And I'll categorize what's been happening with the China-Russia trade and maybe where it's going. So Chinese direct exports to Russia dipped after the war initially occurred in 2022 after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that's because Chinese firms have traditionally been sensitive to running afoul of Western sanctions. A lot of Chinese banks, a lot of Chinese companies have international exposure and rely on dollars, euros, or both. And so Chinese firms, especially in the early days of the war, were very concerned about running afoul of these sanctions. And so you saw a dip in Chinese exports, in particular to Russia. And for about 3 months, Chinese firms were very reluctant to engage with Russian counterparts. That started shifting around June of 2022, about 3 months after the initial full-scale invasion, and gradually ticked upwards and has basically monotonically increased since that time, with an important exception. And since around December of 2024, which is when the West, especially the United States, started to impose stricter sanctions. So President Biden issued an executive order in late December of 2023, imposing financial sector sanctions on Russian entities. And so that led, again, Chinese firms to be more reluctant to engage with Russian counterparts. And so we've seen a downtick in Chinese direct exports to Russia, just going directly from China to Russia. But also importantly, we see a downtick in indirect shipments to Russia. So it's important to note that a couple of different things. One is that Chinese exports to Russia have been very important for the Russian war machine. So there's analysis by Bloomberg Economics, which shows, this is by Gerard DePipo and Alex Izikoff of Bloomberg Intelligence, that about 56% of all Russian imports are attributable to China, either directly or via transshipment from Central Asia and other countries. And so those exports have been very significant for the Russian war machine. And you increasingly see Central Asia as a conduit for this China to Russia trade. So if you look specifically at what's called the Common High Priority List, the CHPL, Russia's direct imports from China are actually down 20% year to date. But if you look at Chinese exports to Belarus and Central Asia, of these CHPL items, they're actually up about 20% year to date. And so even though we see this downtick in direct trade, which also will be impacted by this recent decision to make tightens a little stricter in recent weeks, you will also likely see a diversion of trade to Central Asia and other places. And so that's why, even though direct trade it's important, most China to Russia shipments are done directly, but in the indirect route is also very important. And you will likely see Chinese firms and Russian firms interacting more in Central Asia and other places in order to facilitate this trade. That's where things stand. And I do think it's important to note that Central Asia might be increasingly important for the future of China-Russia trade.
Absolutely. Well, we'll get onto that. Thank you very much for that overview. Could we just go through China and Russia separately then? What kind of goods is Russia, first of all, exporting to China? So what do the Chinese get out of this?
Russia's exports to China are overwhelmingly in commodities. So crude oil is traditionally the centerpiece of Russian exports to China. You've also seen a major uptick in other mineral fuels, especially since the war started. And that increase for quote unquote other mineral fuels is due to a few factors, but largely because shipments along the existing Power of Siberia natural gas pipeline have increased pretty significantly. Coal exports from Russia have also increased pretty significantly as well. So those are the two main categories of exports from Russia to China. There's also some other commodity exports, but in terms of trade from Russia to China, it's almost entirely in commodities.
And what about the other way around? What is China sending to Russia?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Chinese exports to Russia are highly variegated. They're very diverse, and they're also importantly very militarily consequential. And so a couple of export categories have really picked up since the war started. That's machinery as well as vehicle exports. So China's been shipping a lot more vehicles as well as machinery to Russia, especially since the beginning of the conflict. And those items have had military consequence. So for instance, we talked back in, I think it was September of 2023, about China's shipments of excavators as well as it's called front-end shovel loaders. And those are used for digging trenches. And essentially, Chinese industrial goods helped Russia construct the Surovikin mine, which your listeners are familiar with, was a series of defensive fortifications in place across occupied Ukraine. And so because of Chinese industrial shipments, whether it's with trucks, whether it's with excavators, whether it's with other items which can be useful for digging trenches, that's had a military impact on the battlefield. And so that's just in terms of direct exports. And there's also other categories which have been very consequential, a lot of high-tech goods, things that are on the common high priority list. These are items that are subject to sanction. These are directly militarily relevant. Things like chips, things like ball bearings, which can be used for tank production. China is increasingly important for providing these items to Russia. So there's a report by Chris Miller of AEI that features C4ADS data. And those estimates suggest that Russia obtained about 90% of its semiconductor imports from China in 2023. So again, those items have direct battlefield relevance. And these are just direct exports. So things that, according to Chinese customs data, is going directly to Russia. But if you widen the aperture a little bit and look at the totality of trade between China and Russia, that includes not just direct shipments, but also indirect shipments that are occurring via places like Central Asia and like Belarus. And so if you look at China's exports to Central Asia, before the war, they were about $3 billion per month. Now they're about $6 billion per month. So they've roughly doubled. And that's not because Central Asian economies have doubled over that time. What's obviously happening is that a lot of these goods, which are being shipped from China, notionally into Central Asia and Belarus, are in fact going directly to Russia. And so those indirect exports can be things like ball bearings. We've talked about, your listeners may remember in September, we talked about how ball bearing exports from China are potentially being used for tank production in Russia. And Russia is most likely getting those ball bearing exports from China via Kyrgyzstan, which has dramatically increased its imports of Chinese ball bearings. And so there's other categories too, things like vehicle spare parts. Kyrgyzstan and other countries in Central Asia have dramatically increased imports of vehicle spare parts. And that actually, interestingly, started occurring before the war. So around November of 2021, December of 2021, that's when you started seeing this major and actually massive increase in vehicle spare parts imports across Central Asia. And I strongly suspect that Russian procurement agents were looking, they were aware that the Kremlin was about to invade, it was to launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And so they're most likely stockpiling militarily consequential items ahead of the invasion. So all that's to say is that when you look at Chinese trade with Russia, when you look at Chinese exports to Russia, you have to look at not just the direct shipments, but also the indirect shipments, especially via Central Asia, and frankly, especially via Kyrgyzstan.
Joe, lots of people will be listening to this and they might think, well, what can countries do about this? Is there any mechanism or is there any thinking about how Western countries may stop something like the indirect export of Chinese goods, dual-use goods that can have a military purpose to Russia via Central Asian states?
Yeah, so it's a very timely and important question. And so the first thing I would say is that, again, sanctions have had an impact in influencing Chinese firms. There's only been 2 downticks in Chinese exports to Russia since the war started. The first was directly after the war when Western countries, led by Washington and Brussels, started imposing these sanctions. The second has been in recent months since the imposition of stronger sanctions in December of 2023. So sanctions do have an impact. We need to be honest and realistic about the potential, the consequences of these sanctions. They're not a silver bullet. They're not going to take Russia's trade with China down to levels we'd like to see. But that being said, they do have an influence on shaping the behavior of Chinese firms and the Chinese state. The second point I make regarding indirect trade. So yeah, it can be difficult to block this trade because there is some level of plausible deniability for these firms, which are shipping goods notionally to Kyrgyzstan, and then those goods are re-exported to Russia. So there's some pretty obvious problems with that. That being said, there are steps that the West can take. So I would suggest that as Western policymakers go about tackling this problem, they look especially closely at Kyrgyzstan because Kyrgyzstan is in many ways the most prolific and consequential violator of the spirit of sanctions. And Kyrgyzstan has always had issues with weak enforcement of customs. They have a lot of issues with governance as well as pervasive corruption. And so you can't really look at Kyrgyzstan's imports because they don't report them accurately, unfortunately. But if you look at all countries exporting to Kyrgyzstan, you see that total exports to Kyrgyzstan doubled from 2021 to 2023. So they're about $26 billion in 2023 last year. Chinese exports over that same time period from 2021 to 2023 rose from about 7.5 billion to 20 billion. And so that trade is obviously being redirected to Russia. And so when policymakers are considering how do we tackle this problem, you have to focus in on the most important violator of the spirit of sanctions, and that's Kyrgyzstan. And if you look at specific products, things like spare parts, Kyrgyzstan is quintupled imports of spare parts from 2021 to 2023. As we talked about, imports of ball bearings from China rose over 1,500% over that same time period. And Kyrgyzstan imports about as many Chinese goods as Kazakhstan does, even though Kazakhstan's economy is about 20 times larger. So that gives you a important context for the scope of the problem. And when we talk about things that the West can do to stop trade via Kyrgyzstan, there's a few factors here. The first is that Western companies that have production in China, in some cases, might be exporting to Russia with a degree of plausible deniability via Kyrgyzstan. So there's frankly more that the West can probably do to discourage Western firms with production in China to export, especially to Kyrgyzstan, given that we know that a large share, if not the overwhelming majority of these exports are just going to be shipped directly to Russia. That's the indirect route. So again, policymakers can strongly discourage Western firms with operations in China from exporting to Kyrgyzstan. The second is that many Western companies are directly shipping goods to Kyrgyzstan. So for instance, German, Italian, and French exports to Kyrgyzstan stood at about $1.2 billion in 2023. And that's up from about $100 million at the beginning of the conflict. And so there's, again, obviously, many of those goods are just being re-exported to Russia. So there's a lot that we can do collectively as the West. And again, these are just my own personal opinions here, whether it's for stopping direct exports to Kyrgyzstan, which then are most likely shipped to Russia, or discouraging Western firms from exporting to Kyrgyzstan if they have operations based in China.
A rather simplistic question from me, really. But as you said earlier, Kyrgyzstan's economy hasn't taken off, so where is all this stuff going? But what do the Central Asian states get out of this arrangement? Are they just being good allies? Does it benefit their economies? If so, how?
It's a good question. So there's a lot of different levels to this, trade. So again, I think different states are taking a different approach. Different Central Asian countries are taking different approaches to this. Kyrgyzstan has arguably been the least constructive in its approach to it. But it's important to note that it's not just the government necessarily acting in this way. There's also potential for sub-state actors. There's lots of criminal smuggling networks across Central Asia. And so it's hard to disentangle how much of this is driven by private sector or even criminal organizations versus the state. But it's clear in Kyrgyzstan that the state either lacks the capacity or the will to really degrade this trade significantly. And that's very concerning given that there's the potential for more trade. Both China and Russia are incentivized to find different export routes given the strength of U.S. and Western sanctions. And yeah, so in terms of how these states benefit from this, it's important to acknowledge, too, that's a very difficult neighborhood. Central Asians live surrounded by two huge authoritarian powers. And so I think it's important to be sensitive to that. At the same time, it's also clear that many of these countries are not doing very much to stop illicit and unhelpful trade between China and Russia. And in some cases, the officials might benefit from this trade. So the officials in Central Asia might receive some cut of the profits, which are taking place, or they just lack the capacity. But in any case, regardless of the intentions, especially of Kyrgyzstan officials, it's still very problematic for the West and especially for Ukraine.
So just to sum up, how significant is this relationship between China and Russia for the Russian war economy? And what do you see happening in the next few months, the rest of this year?
Without Chinese exports, Russia very well could have lost this conflict already. So again, Bloomberg Intelligence estimates that about China's share of all Russian imports was about 25% before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and now it stands at about 56% of all trade. And that includes transshipments via Central Asia. And as we've talked about, China has been providing militarily consequential goods such as excavators, such as other trench digging equipment, things that can be used for tank production, for armored personnel carrier production, as well as things like semiconductors, which can be used for missiles or for drones. And so I would say Chinese facilitation of the war effort has been extremely consequential for Russia. And so it's also important to note that's come at very significant cost for the Chinese economy. There are some analysts who will say that China's benefited economically from the war. That does not seem to align with the data. China is the world's largest commodity importer. They're the world's largest importer of food, of oil and gas. And so those prices rose very significantly, especially in 2022, and they were impacted by those worsening terms of trade. Additionally, the war has also impacted China's exports, especially to the European Union as well as the United States. So the U.S. accounts for about $426 billion in USD. China exported about $430 billion to the U.S. in 2023, about another $500 billion to the European Union. And both of those figures have declined a little bit since mid-2022. And there are a lot of factors for that, but it's clear that China's facilitation of the war effort is leading to more skepticism in both Brussels and DC. So there's been a major hit to Chinese exports at a global level. And even though Chinese exports to Russia have risen pretty substantially, it's important to note that it's a relatively small amount. So again, in 2023, China exported about $110 billion to Russia. And if you tack on the indirect trade, that 110 is the direct trade, by the way. If you tack on indirect trade, that's maybe another $30 billion, give or take some. And so that's about $140 billion of direct exports to, or direct and indirect exports to Russia. Again, compare that to the US, which Chinese exports in 2023 were about $430 billion. And then exports to the EU were about $500 billion. So if you're in Beijing, you're really damaging your prospects in two of your largest export markets to go trade with Russia, which is not a dynamic economy. And in many cases, China is losing access to some of the world's best technology because of this trade. So the economics of this are really puzzling, but all that's to say, that's a really long-winded way of saying that China is willing to pay a price for this facilitation of war effort with Russia. Beijing, the Chinese government, regards this as a significant priority. They want Putin to at least not lose the war. And I think they strongly prefer that Putin win the war in Ukraine. And so when we think about the scope of China-Russia relations, it's important to remember Beijing is very committed to keeping Putin in power.
Joe Webster, is there anything we haven't said about this story that you think is important for our listeners?
Well, again, thanks for having me on today. I would just reiterate that, again, as the West increasingly applies sanctions to Russia and strengthens and tightens those sanctions, China is going to look at different options. They're going to look at, most importantly, they're going to look at transferring some of the risk onto local and regional banks that do not have international exposure, but they're also going to increasingly look at this indirect route, especially via Kyrgyzstan. And so the West needs to look very closely at some of the pros and cons of placing sanctions and tightening trade restrictions with Kyrgyzstan, whether that's by discouraging Western firms with operations in China from exporting to Kyrgyzstan, or by, frankly, just ensuring that Western companies do not export to Kyrgyzstan. I think these are things we really need to be talking about. There are certain second-order consequences we have to consider as well, especially vis-a-vis Kazakhstan. But we do need to be looking at in placing much stricter trade measures on Kyrgyzstan.
Joe Webster, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, we hear Dom's final thoughts. Just a quick message from us before we move on. On Saturday the 29th of June, Ukraine the Latest will be doing a live show at the Stephen Joseph Theatre in Scarborough in the northeast of England. The show will be in the early evening, and myself, Dom, Francis and Roland Oliphant will be discussing the military lessons for the West from 2 years of the full-scale invasion. For tickets, just go to the Scarborough Fair website or follow the link in the show notes. We really look forward to seeing you there. Well, thank you very much, Dom, for all of those updates and talking us through them. Can I come back to you for a final thought?
Yeah, thanks, David. Now then, yesterday I asked for thoughts on the moral issues around the strike on Crimea over the weekend, that Ukrainian strike that allegedly killed civilians on the beach. Got a great response from you. Thanks so much for taking the time to offer your ideas. Thanks to Cliff from New Zealand, who wrote in, and his thoughts neatly encapsulates the issues, I think, and Cliff's given me permission to read out his email. He said, you asked for contributions regarding the moral factors in the ATACMS strike on Crimea. What has helped me with these scenarios is looking through a lens of responsibility. Every party with agency has responsibility for the actions they take with that agency. Look at the parties involved. Cliff says, number one, those who planned the strike needed to weigh the risk of harm to Crimean civilians against its military utility and indeed its ability to reduce harm to other parts of Ukraine. Number two, the occupying authorities had responsibility to control risk to the local population by limiting activities near military targets. Number three, the beach-going civilians had responsibility to decide whether the outing was worth the risk. And number 4, the occupying forces had responsibility to consider the risk of air defence actions on civilians. Cliff says, in light of the above, and what we know about the strike, it's my judgment that the level of risk assumed by Ukraine was justifiable, and those who were harmed were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Thanks, Cliff. I think that neatly puts an edge around all the issues, a lot more to unpack, and I'd still welcome any thoughts that you have if you want to write in. But yes, I think that is about as far as we can go with it. I do think targeteers, those military personnel who are responsible for trying to work out what weapon is best suited against which target and what's the likely collateral damage estimate of that, as in unintended harm to civilians and infrastructure. So I think if they were indeed attacking the Belbek Air Base or anywhere near Sevastopol, I think they would have assumed they would have taken into account any potential for civilian harm, and they would have deemed that was justifiable. And I think you're right, the occupying authorities do have responsibility to say to people, look, this is a war. Of course, they're not going to say that. But if they said, we're in the middle of, even if they use the silly expression of special military operation, but if they said, this beach is right next to an airbase, you might not want to go there, then that might be a bit more responsible than not saying anything. Of course, they're not going to say that either, because they want to portray normality. They want people to go on holiday. They're offering cut price deals for people to go to Crimea on holiday. So there's this false sense of normality. But I think Cliff has hit the nail on the head there, and I thank you for your contribution. But as ever, very happy to take other thoughts on this, and I'm sure it's a subject we'll return to again, David.
Thank you very much, Dom Nicholls, and thank you again to all of our listeners for writing in. It's a complex, nuanced and tricky issue, so thank you to all of you who shared your thoughts, especially as a lot of this is evolving in front of our eyes, specifically thinking of drone combat and Dom's question yesterday of how do you actually surrender to a drone. So thank you all for writing in. It's hugely appreciated by all of us. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.